Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the museum. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the trustees, our staff, our great volunteers, everyone involved with the museum. Welcome. Welcome to another one of our Revolutionaries series. It's the latest in this ongoing look at people who have been and are creating the revolution that's all around us and has changed the world of computing and our lives forever. We're very fortunate tonight to have Intel as our major funder. Those of you who are here for most of the evenings know that we always credit Intel. This is their fourth year to participate, and we're really happy to have them as the major underwriter. We are absolutely thrilled to have Tod Machover here tonight from the MIT Media Lab. Tod is currently the professor of music and media at the lab. He joined it in 1985. He's head of the Hyper Instruments and Opera of the Future group. And that is a mouthful. And what he's doing in hyper instruments and the reinterpretation and actually creation of new forms of music, where music and technology intersect, is his space. He occupies it with immense creativity and talent. And he is also, on top of that, co-director of the Things That Think and the Toys of Tomorrow consortia. Wouldn't you love to have a toy of tomorrow? So we'll ask Tod a little bit about what his vision is for that. He's done that since 1995. We'll learn a little bit more about why Tod mixes and so creatively produces new ways of thinking about music and technology. On the music side, he has designed and implemented interactive systems for Peter Gabriel and Prince. We're going to hear more about his work in hyper instruments, which are just a magnificent way to take what humans can create with musical instruments and amplify them using technology. He is a prolific composer. He has commissioned and performed, had commissioned and performed works throughout the world, including some of the world's most prestigious ensembles and soloists. He has composed significant works for Yo-Yo Ma, Joshua Bell, the Boston Pops, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and many others. He is a visiting professor of composition at the Royal Academy of Music in London. The opera that he writes, the many operas that he has written, have been fantastic, including the interactive brain opera, which you'll hear a little bit about tonight. He's also authored Resurrection in 1999, based on Tolstoy's last novel, Skellig in 2008, based on the best-selling and award-winning novel by David Almond, and that was commissioned by Sage Gateshead in the United Kingdom. And then Death and the Powers, which we'll also hear a little bit more about tonight, which was had an absolutely breathtaking premiere in Monaco in 2010. The libretto is by the U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky. So Tod runs in an amazingly creative crowd. Ray Kurzweil, who you just saw in the opening segment, said, Tod Machover is the only person I am aware of who contributes on a world-class level to both the technology of music creation and to music itself. Even within these two distinct areas, his contributions are remarkably diverse and of exquisite quality. So we're delighted to have him here tonight to talk about this and more. Please join me in welcoming Tod Machover. I would like to give everybody a sense of what you do. We'll get into why you do it and how you came to do it. But let's talk right now about the things that you're working on, you're most interested in.
Okay, well, maybe we'll start with a couple of glimpses. I've really tried to concentrate during these last years in making music as transformative as possible. That's why it's called transforming music, so it can really grab people and change their lives, but also as accessible to as many people as possible, so that music can be participated in by everybody. I'll give you a quick glimpse. I think we'll come back to this later.
Yes.
Because it needs a little more explanation. But right now, actually I launched this 2 weeks ago. It's a project that's going to continue over this coming year, and it's the one that's giving me the most headaches. But I was asked by the Toronto Symphony to write a new piece for orchestra, and I decided that the challenge that I wanted to take for this piece was to invite the entire city of Toronto to compose it with me. So you can help too if you want. We're going to need all the help again.
You have no small ideas, Tod.
No. So this one, we'll come back to a little later, and I'll tell you why we're doing it and maybe a little bit about how we're doing it. But since you mentioned this most recent opera, maybe I'll just talk a tiny bit about it because it'll give people a little glimpse of how these different things come together and a little bit what they sound like. So as John said, the largest piece that I finished recently is called Death and the Powers. And it is an opera. Opera's attracted me because it combines all the senses, all the different art forms, but music gets to be in the middle of it, so it's been very attractive. This particular one I think of as a robotic opera because there are robots as characters, and actually the whole infrastructure is a big robot. It's true that it was commissioned by Monaco, by Prince Albert and Princess Caroline and a group of patrons. So it was pretty funny to have this 21st century opera with robots have its first performance in quite a traditional opera house in Monaco. Talk about scary, but that went pretty well. It's been touring in the States, and with luck, we'll come to the Bay Area in about a year and a half, so stay tuned for that. It's a story about a man who wants to live forever. Actually, he's kind of tired of the world, and it's almost as if, you saw Bill Gates up there, it's almost as if Bill Gates woke up one day and said, you know, I've given all this money to cure malaria and all this money to fix education, but things haven't gotten that much better. So I'm leaving, but I want everything about myself to remain. So that's what he wants. He wants his personality and his connection to the people he loves and his memories and everything about him to stay, but he wants to leave the world. So he figures out a way to make something called the system, where he can download everything about himself into his environment. And at the beginning of the opera, the character, Simon Powers, is about to turn on the system, says he's going to go, and everybody around him, his family, the people he works with, are all wondering, will it still be you? What's it going to be like when you're physically not here, but everything else, you're in the environment? So he does make this system. The entire stage is made up of these huge walls, three-sided walls, which are giant robots, 3 tons each. They all, in principle, have eyes and ears and make their way on their own around stage. The orchestra in the orchestra pit looks very nervously when these gigantic things are... there's a big chandelier, which looks like a light chandelier at the beginning of the show, but is actually a giant robot music instrument that vibrates and actually captures Evie, the wife, in the middle of the opera, and they have a kind of love duet between this woman and a chandelier. Yes, probably. I don't know of another opera so far that does that. And then the walls kind of express the inner soul of the main character. So they show light and image and kind of gesture. And there is a chorus of robots. There are 12 robots in the opera, and they're kind of in between the humans and this new world of the system. And they're also autonomous. They find their way on stage. They react to characters. And here's just a little tiny glimpse of what the robots look like, because they're kind of cute.
Tonight we delve into a world where opera and MIT technology collide.
We wanted these robots to feel like they had human reactions but didn't look anything like humans. So the robots come close to stealing the show. We wanted to make something, as I said, that the robots don't look human, but you really felt wondering why you feel so close to them. It's interesting. And to make all of this work, we had to invent new technologies to measure the main character, because after the first 15 or 20 minutes, he turns on the system, he says, I'm out of here, he leaves. The rest of the show, until the very end, it's the stage that represents him, and he's down in the orchestra pit in a special booth. So we measure his singing, we measure his gestures, but we also measure his breathing and his muscle tension and his level of excitement. So things he's conscious of while he's performing, but also things that are kind of his inner being, his soul.
So he's interacting in real time.
He is acting in real time, and all of what he's doing, both what he's conscious of and just what he's feeling, is influencing everything on stage. The sounds, where they are in the theater, the way these robots behave, the way the walls behave. And the idea is, you really literally, all this infrastructure really is him. So maybe I'll just show a quick clip, just 2 minutes from the opera. You'll get to see the entire opera in 2 minutes. It's a rare treat, and then we'll go on and talk about other things. So here's 2 minutes from Death and the Powers.
tracks never in the matter.
So the robots get the last word. But do stay tuned, because with any luck, we'll bring the full show to San Francisco soon.
Well, I have a feeling Toronto is really in for it now, since you're composing an opera there in this entirely new way. We'll talk about that more in just a minute.
Yeah.
So let's go back. Now that we've given everybody a little bit of a taste of what you're currently working on, let's go back to the beginning, because for you, music and technology intersects almost in your DNA because of your father and your mother. Wilma, very talented pianist, Juilliard trained. Your father, Carl, one of the pioneers of computer graphics in the country. Talk a little bit about what it was like to have that kind of duality in your life.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So there they are. I think that's me in the middle. It's absolutely true. Incredibly interesting in so many ways. So you're right. My dad grew up in the Midwest and was a very visual guy, popular culture person, and was an engineer and believed very, very strongly, was in that first generation who, after World War II, who believed that computers would only make an impact in the world if you could interact with them in some intuitive way. So because he was a visual guy, he became one of the pioneers in computer graphics and a real evangelist for computer graphics. And he had a company in the New York area where we lived, and we always used to go in and see the early displays and light pens and things you could control on computers very early on, and just the idea that this stuff was being built and changed every day. My mom grew up in New York City and is still. I talked to her today when I got off the plane, and she had one of her students there at the house. And she's not only a terrific piano teacher, but a very, very creative piano teacher. So when we were little, she used to have us, we'd have our piano lessons, and then the lesson would be over, and she'd say, okay, just stay for 10 more minutes. And I want you to spend 3 minutes and go anywhere in the house and bring back some object that makes an interesting sound. So we'd all run around the house and bring back something, a lamp, a chair, the car, I don't know, something, and bring it. And she'd say, okay, what does that one sound like? That one. Oh, great. What's the loudest sound you can make with that? And what's the softest sound? Oh, that's it. What does it sound like if you play those at the same time? Oh, that's great, those two. Now, what's a word you could use to describe that sound? So now we have all these words. Let's make a story out of these. How would you start? So we'd do this for 10 minutes, and we'd make a story, which of course was a piece of music. And 4 or 5 little kids would have done this. And then she'd say, okay, when you go home, make a picture of this when you're at home, so when we come back next week, we'll remember what we did. So in that little experiment, we all learned that, first of all, music wasn't something that a bunch of dead white guys made and wrote down on manuscript paper. Anybody could make music. Music comes from the world around you. Human beings make the systems you need to make the music. Even something like notation, the notes of music, are nothing more than a way of remembering what you did so you can do it again. So it was an incredibly creative way to grow up. And I think the fact that my mom was a high culture musician and my dad was a popular culture technologist, and they had like the best relationship in the world. You know, they were really a very special couple. I think that was both a wonderful thing and also kind of an obsession of mine to figure out how those worlds fit together. And you know, I didn't expect to do music and technology, but I, you know, kind of ended up doing that.
Ended up that way. In fact, there's a very special relationship between your parents and our predecessor, the Computer Museum in Boston.
There is. So my dad was quite involved with a lot of the early institutions for computing. He was, you know, SIGGRAPH, and he was quite involved with the Boston Computer Museum, which I can't remember what year it started, but it was started by Gwen Bell, I think.
Yeah, Gwen and Gordon Bell.
Yeah, and it was the predecessor of this place.
Yeah.
And
so did they choose to have his 70th birthday at the museum? Was that a specific wish that he had?
It was. I'm trying to remember. I think it was a surprise, as I remember. So we put on a symposium. The Computer Museum invited us to do this, and it was an incredible event, sort of a who's who of people in computing. It was in 1997. And my dad passed away just 3 months ago, actually, and for those of you who get the IEEE CG&A, the current issue, the one that just came out, July, August, Andy Van Dam, who's also one of the great computer graphics pioneers, wrote a really fantastic tribute, I think, that captures what he was like as a person, what he was like as an evangelist and you know, technologist for computer graphics, and it even captured his cartoons. He was truly a gifted visual person and a very nice and funny man. So.
Famous for annotating his papers with these caricatures.
That's true. Yeah. Both the real papers and then the books we have at home, he then re-annotated them, you know, just for fun.
So there you are, music in one half of your brain, technology in the other half. You go the music route initially to Juilliard.
Yeah, and so even before Juilliard, definitely when I was a kid, I was much more interested in I would say people stuff, so I was interested in politics, history. I used to dress up like Teddy Roosevelt for some, I don't know why, I went on TV and stumped the MC by knowing more about Teddy Roosevelt than he did. And I played the cello, so I started on piano, and although my mom is a great piano teacher, I don't know how many of you have taken music lessons with your parents. It's not the best idea, so I didn't just find another piano teacher, I found another instrument. I changed to cello, but it turned out cello for me was really the right instrument and central to everything I do. You know, cello's the one instrument that's kind of the size of a person. You know, it's same height. It uses the whole range of your strength. You know, you can pretty much lay into it with all of your power, but it's also very delicate. It's the only instrument that can play the lowest note a human being can sing, the low C under the bass clef, like a Russian bass, continually all the way up to a high C above the treble clef that a coloratura or soprano can sing. And you can make almost any sound with it. And the physicality of playing this instrument has always stayed in my mind when I design new instruments. So I played classical cello until I was a teenager. Then I played a lot of rock music. I wired my cello. I played it like a guitar and started having it make really, really weird sounds. And a little bit before this picture was taken, this came out. Any of you ever heard of this? No?
People of a certain age will definitely remember when that came out.
They might remember. And actually, I don't know how many of you remember what was totally unique about this album. One thing that was unique that really, for me, was just the music and the sound. I mean, it was the first huge argument I had with my mom about, you know, she just didn't get it. And for me, it was like, oh my gosh, this combination of instruments and other sounds all brought together, and it was very beautiful and simple, but also complex. But there was something totally new about this album. Anybody, do you know what that was? Anybody? What? So it's a themed album, that's true. I'll tell you. What it was about Sgt. Pepper's was that it was the first album the Beatles made, or anybody made, that was designed never to be played live. They got so tired, number one, of playing live. You've heard the story of Shea Stadium, where they played in larger and larger stadiums. The sound systems were awful. The crowds were screaming. They couldn't hear each other. They were playing out of tune. It just wasn't fun anymore. But they also, with the help of George Martin, realized that the technology of the studio was magic, and it was something different. And you could go into a studio and take sounds from everywhere and bring them together, make them into new hybrids, fit them perfectly, and make something in a studio that you could never play live. So Sgt. Pepper's was never imagined as something that they would take on tour. And when that came out, there was kind of a cognitive dissonance for me, which really was behind a lot of what I do, which is on the one hand, I thought, this is the future of music. This music is so great, and the technology that allowed this to be made is fantastic, but something is really lost because it's no longer spontaneous and it's only pre-recorded. So what would it be like if you could have the best of both worlds? If you could have that richness and complexity and directness, but also have the physicality of playing an instrument, the spontaneity of sharing it with your band or with your friends. And so that kind of lodged in my head for where I was going.
And when you did go away to school, to Juilliard and to train, was that an obsession of yours, or was it just in the back of your mind that somehow you were going to make these two things fit together?
Great question. It was definitely in the back of my mind. So I don't think I would have picked Juilliard if I really wanted to work with machines. You've all gone to Juilliard? How do you? It's true. So I went there to write for instruments and to learn the craft. And I was actually very lucky. I studied. I should ask if anybody knows who this is. No, it's Elliott Carter, who's probably the greatest living composer. He's definitely the oldest living composer. He's 104 years old now. And it's a great story. You should look it up, Elliott Carter. And at 104, he's still totally active. He has commissions from the Boston Symphony and the Berlin Philharmonic. He wrote his first opera. I wrote my first opera at the age of, 30. He wrote his first opera at the age of 95. And it's pretty good, too. It's, but an amazing man. And when I went to study with him, it's because his instrumental music was the most interesting and complex, and I thought was very exciting. But while I was studying with him, I just started imagining sounds in my head that couldn't be made easily with traditional instruments. And this was in the mid to late 70s. The whole Moog synthesizer analog electronics age was over. Nobody anywhere was really doing that. Computers had just started. Computers, Stanford was a big place, MIT, Princeton, Columbia were the big places for computers. But they were all big, unwieldy machines. It took like a week to get a sound back. So nobody really, no musicians were really working too much with big computers then. But I decided to learn how to program because I just had this. That's when I think the two sides of my parents, it clicked that these crazy sounds that I was imagining, technology and especially software was the most malleable general environment you could possibly find. And if you could learn how to program, you could take anything from your imagination and make it real. So when I was at Juilliard, nobody else was doing this. I went to some place downtown where I found a machine with Fortran. I sort of talked my way in and learned how to do that, enough so that there's somebody named Pierre Boulez, who some of you might know, who at that time was conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He knew Carter. He knew that I was doing these experiments with technology. And he got invited to start the music part of the Pompidou Center in Paris called IRCAM. And I did my bachelor's at Juilliard, my master's, started my doctorate. And in the first year of my doctorate, I got invited to go to Paris. This brand new institute opened. A lot of you have maybe been to the Pompidou Center? Yes? Yeah. And so next to the Pompidou, there's this fountain with bright colors, and it's actually called the Stravinsky Fountain. And under that fountain is this amazing music institute. And I got to go as a guinea pig when it was first opened. And when I got there, this guy in the middle sitting down with the glasses, his name is Giuseppe Di Giugno, was an Italian nuclear physicist who'd also been invited. And he decided to make a computer specially for music. And it had just started to work kind of when I walked in the door. So all of a sudden, you had a computer which you could program to do anything, which you could also touch like an instrument. And nobody knew how to program it. Nobody knew what to do with it. But I sort of sensed my calling and stayed there. I stayed there for 7 years, became head of music research. That's Boulez.
I love that previous picture because it pretty much cuts across the way we all looked in the 70s. You know, the guy on the right, sort of the clean-cut guy with the glasses, and you're in the middle. You know, you kind of got that switched-on look, but then the guy on the left definitely is
switched out. I guess
he is out there.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, and he was the software guy. He was a mathematician who you know, didn't play music at all, but had the gift for figuring out how to program these crazy machines.
Yeah.
Totally. So that's Boulez on the left. One thing that we did is we made the first live instruments, computerized instruments. This was a keyboard. I think the piece was called Fusione Fugace, and it was the first live computer performance anybody had ever done.
Now, what was it you were trying to achieve at this point? What was in your head that said, there are a set of constraints about a musical instrument like a piano that I want to transcend? What was it you were searching for?
I think it was, you know, if you go back to this image of the Beatles in the studio making Sgt. Pepper's, the later things, how can you make music which has the kind of richness and layers and complexity that's interesting, but how can you do it so a human being can shape all these things, not, you know, if you go into a studio, nothing happens in real time. I put down one note, you know, like, boop, 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 boop. Okay, I like that. Now let's set that. Now I'm going to go back and put down the drum. And now what I wanted to do is figure out a way that you could control all those layers together like an instrument. So
was the software meeting your expectations at that point? Did you
there
find
was no
tools?
software.
Well,
there was nothing. There was no software. There was no interface. This, you know, we built this key. There were, you know, this was before the personal computer. Just before, it was before MIDI, which is the industry standard to connect these things. So we had to think about all the original ideas for how do you send information, how do you, you know, measure the interesting musical things. So yeah, and but the reason to do that was so a human being, with your intuitions and with your hands and your body, could shape the most sophisticated music.
So you were out there on the raw frontier of this intersection.
Yeah, I think raw is a good word for it. It was, yeah, it was. It was absolutely the beginning, and it was incredibly exciting, and it turned out that it combined a lot of things that I really love to do. And right about, so I'd been making these instruments. I kind of got known for composing for them, thinking about how to humanize this computer technology so it didn't feel like punch cards. And I got a call one day from a guy named Nicholas Negroponte. I don't know how many of you know. Yeah, some of you know him? Maybe some of you are related to him. I don't know.
And you needed a home, and he knew you or knew of you.
Well, I guess I was known for doing this kind of work, and I also, I guess, was known for helping to start new places. You know, I'd been at Earcom when it was new, and so Negroponte was just about to start a place called the Media Lab at MIT, and asked if I wanted to come back from France and be a professor there. And I'd been in France for 7 years, and I just had a feeling that something special was going to go on at the Media Lab. So I went back, and I've been there ever since.
And the new phrase, by the way, which we see, is not interdisciplinary, it's anti-disciplinary. And in fact, you're so anti, the word anti is upside down. That's how anti the Media Lab really is now when it comes to discipline. It's much more about breakout ideas, and really always has been. Yeah,
whereas the place in Paris was trying to bring musicians and scientists and technologists together, I was more and more interested in bringing in image and bringing in movement and thinking about neuroscience and how it impacts music, and you couldn't do that in Paris. The idea behind the Media Lab was basically to use technology to make the quality of life better in as many different ways as possible, in as many contexts as possible. So there was no idea of this field or that field belongs or didn't belong. So from the very beginning, it was a place for artists, but also for thinking about the future of education, thinking about the future of health, thinking about the future of computing and data.
Music.
Music, absolutely.
Do you find the kind of unfettered creative freedom that you were looking for at the Media Lab? Because that's not that common in academia.
It isn't that common in academia. And I've been there now for 25 years, and sort of every time I hear somebody go, oh, that's I know. But I'm not sure there's another place exactly like it, and I do think that it has a very unusual quality of supporting creative freedom. I think MIT is an unusual place. There's this other institute called Harvard right next door. And it's pretty good, but it's literally right next door, and the cultures couldn't be more different. I mean, Harvard is based on a European. I was just in London a few days ago, and we took our daughters to see Oxford. You know, Harvard was based on that model of departments and knowledge being transferred. MIT has always been a place where people make things. So it's a place for design and invention, and it moves very quickly. Its departments in general are fluid, and it's very unhierarchical. So, you know, Europe, each department usually has one professor. There's the professor of music or the professor of linguistics. MIT, it's typical for, you know, a Nobel Prize winner and a grad student and an undergrad and maybe a high school intern to literally solve problems together. And I love the Media Lab because at MIT, it's the freest place and the least hierarchical. And I really do think it's very unusual.
So it was here that you began to really explore the concept and the creation of a hyper instrument. So can we talk a little bit about what a hyper instrument is, what your vision for it is, how it works, and taking it now a step further, when some of the technology that wasn't there for you when you were creating in Paris suddenly is there for you?
Yeah. So that's my space in the Media Lab. You see the robots, that's what they do when they're not performing. They get to sunbathe, basically, in Cambridge whenever there's any sun.
That's one of the rare sunny days there, I think.
I know. That's why I took this picture.
Yeah.
I thought I'd entice some of you to come back to Cambridge. So this is Yo-Yo Ma, as you might recognize, a few years ago. And the first hyper instruments we made were similar to what you saw with me sitting at a keyboard. You know, maybe fancier keyboards, but basically using instruments that you could buy on the market, measuring the way people touch the keys, the rhythm, and analyzing them to see how the music was being played. But what I got interested in was the gesture and the touch and all of the acoustic sound, the things which are not present in just an electronic instrument, how to measure those and how to capture the soul of those kind of sounds. So one of the kind of big transitional projects was this hypercello that we built for Yo-Yo. We measured the sound of Yo-Yo playing the cello. I'll play that video again. You can see on his right wrist, there's a blue device, which is actually what's called a Hall effect sensor. It measures the movement of his wrist in this direction and this direction. It turns out that's a very reliable way of knowing the style of bowing, so you can tell if somebody's bowing legato or marcato, you know, jagged or smooth or pizzicato, all just from the wrist. On this cello, we had strips of plastic on the fingerboard that sent electricity up and down, so you could measure where the finger was stopping the string. We spent a lot of time on the bow itself, because a bow for a cellist is like breathing for a singer. It's where most of the expression is. So you have to know how fast the bow is moving, how the horsehair is gripping the string, the angle of the bow, how much bow you're using. That really tells you what the emotion is behind the playing. So we had to invent technology to do that. Actually, originally what I wanted to do is have, you know, Yo-Yo has one of the world's great cellos, one of the top Stradivariuses. And so I wanted to have him play the Stradivarius to make all these measurements. And Yo-Yo's also really, really a nice guy. But when I started talking about gluing sensors and tacks onto his Strat...
That was a showstopper.
I don't know why, but he didn't want to do that. So we actually had to build the cello from scratch. So we built a, you know, it's all out of wood. Part of my idea when we work with top-end musicians, whether it's Yo-Yo or Prince, as you mentioned before, Bono, these are people who have incredible experience and skill. So when I make a new kind of instrument, I want it to play like the traditional instrument, and I want to use expressive abilities that they already have. So for instance, with Yo-Yo, an instrument like this, the notes might look like a normal score, but an instruction might say, in this section, if you use more bow or less bow, it will determine whether you have just a single cello line or more and more of a whole orchestra might creep out just by how much bow you use. Or if you drive the tempo with more and more tension to the downbeat of this bar, the cello will change from a cello sound into a voice or into a trumpet or into an electronic sound you've never heard before. And this will all happen just by the way you interpret that phrase. And you can do it differently each time. but the instrument will react the same if you do the same thing.
You used a very specific word when we were talking about this earlier, which is actually trying to capture his emotion, the emotion that he's bringing to a particular passage, which is really kind of an amazing concept, that you can take that emotion, sense it, capture it, and then cause it to move the music into a kind of altered state that his own feeling is representing.
That's right, and I think 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it would have been probably not taken too seriously to talk about computers measuring emotion or displaying emotion or analyzing emotion. I think now it's a serious field being studied in many places, and music is an ideal way to think about emotion. It's one of the, it's one of the deepest human experiences where we react in a deeply emotional way when we hear music. A performer feels this emotion, transmits it from the mind through the body out into the air, and there are more and more ways to both study it and model it. So we do try to measure this emotion, and I also think it's going to be, I see some teenagers out in the audience. This is a major field for the next generation, is to understand how our emotions work, how to analyze them, and how to really measure them with our machines, because that's what you want so you can respond in a natural way when you're using any kind of machine.
So two questions about this encounter with Yo-Yo Ma. First, you composed a piece especially for this purpose, for him to play. But when you heard him play, you knew what you had written, but then you heard the result of this hyperized music, as you were saying. How did it sound for you?
Well, luckily, we worked on this particular project with Yo-Yo for a year, and Yo-Yo lives in Boston. So the answer is, the first time I heard it, it was like, uh-oh.
Really?
Well, it's hard to make this kind of thing work. It's hard to measure the right things. It's hard to, make it so that, just as you say, the subtlest change that he's capable of can bring out this beautiful, subtle sound. It took a lot of fine-tuning. So we got to, I knew that the music that I'd written, the basic structure, the melodies, the way it was shaped, that felt right pretty quickly. But exactly how the instrument responded, it took a good 5 or 6 months of fine-tuning and changing the software and changing the measurement and changing how the instrument reacted until it felt just right.
And so at that point, after the initial trial, did Yo-Yo say to you in his nice way, Tod, this is okay, but if it's all the same to you, I just prefer the sound of my own cello? Oh. Or did he roll with it?
I'll tell you two things about Yo-Yo, and it's typical of, I think, any top-level musician. Well, untypical is that Yo-Yo, again, is a very nice guy, and he's also so talented that he can take anything that you give him and make it sound good. So one of the problems of working with him is when we started the project and the hypercello wasn't all that great and the sounds weren't all that great, he could actually give it a little nudge here and there and make it sound really good. So he might have said, oh, it's okay, let's stop here, or he might have convinced us that that was the case. I mean, I knew that we had to push further, so we did. But he was a very nice collaborator. But I remember very well what he said. He was excited to do this. He still plays this piece. He's still involved with this kind of thing with us. But he always said, at the moment where it's easier for me to tour with a hypercello than it is to tour with my Stradivarius, that's when I'll change. He didn't say when it sounds better or when it does something magical that my cello can't do. He said, I'm a practical musician. I'm all around. When it's easier, this is the one I'll take. And I think, honestly, it still probably isn't easier to bring it around, although now, all I need is a laptop, and it's pretty easy to do. Still, a piece of wood in a box is probably easier to bring around. And
from a technical standpoint, what were you doing at this point? Are you writing your own code? You're working on your own custom hardware? Talk a little bit about the technical backbone.
Yeah, in general, it's changed a little now because there's so much, this whole field is so rich and there's so much being done in many places. We can borrow things from other people. In general, we tend to make our own hardware and our own software. The Hypercello project was an extreme case of that. I mean, there were some techniques around, for instance, that could measure the wrist. There were a couple of techniques that we might have borrowed to measure the bow. But my colleagues and I decided that none of them were good enough, and we absolutely started from scratch. Same with the software. There was really nothing then that could do the kind of quick analysis, intelligent processing of all of this data, the coordination of the data. So we wrote it all from scratch. There are some, I won't name them, but there are some software packages out there now that do some of this kind of data processing. We still find that most of them aren't reliable enough. Another thing about doing this kind of project, you can say it's not rocket science, but in a way, in terms of sophistication, but also in terms of how good it has to be, it is kind of like rocket science. You do a project like this for Yo-Yo Ma, and he goes and plays this at Carnegie Hall. I mean, I guess if it doesn't work, nobody dies, but it's really not a good thing. He's got to get on stage, and it has to respond immediately. It has to respond perfectly. Every single gesture he makes, it has to, the sound has to be there. Yeah. It has to be refined. This demanding audience at Carnegie Hall, they're interested in the technology. They can say, oh, it's cool, but at the end of the day, they have to say, wow, that's really beautiful. It's very demanding to do that. And we find that to make all of that work, both in terms of the sophistication and reliability, we kind of have to do it ourselves.
Still to this day.
Unfortunately, still to this day.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe part of it's a perversion. Part of it comes from the fact that each new project, I do all these projects because I have musical ideas, sounds, emotions that I imagine and that I want to bring out into the world. But my imagination it goes back to that first picture of my parents. My imagination somehow always combines this musical impulse with, there's always some new feeling I have of, okay, here's the way it sounds when you hear it, and here's the way it feels when you play it. And the way it feels when you play it, it's not exactly like anything that exists. So we have to make something new. It's kind of part of what drives me, I think. And I think one of the bad thing about that is that it takes extra time, and it would be nice to just sit down and write with a pencil and paper only. The good thing is that really unusual things often come out of it that you don't expect. And actually, it's a good segue to this next thing.
I was going to say, there's a hardware story here, but not hardware like a computer history museum audience might think of hardware. It's a chair.
Yeah, so the end of the story is that we made this sophisticated cello, hypercello for Yo-Yo Ma. And the unusual thing is the instrument we made right after that was a chair. We called it the sensor chair. And I didn't plan it that way. But really quickly, what happened is that in designing this technology for Yo-Yo, the bow was the hardest thing, as I said. It took a long time. We tried many techniques. They were either not reliable, they were very expensive, there was too much hardware on the bow. The bow's like a sports car, it's very, very refined. So if you put too much technology on the bow, you can't play with it anymore. So it turned out the technique that worked the best was to put 2 little chips on either end of the bow, to send electricity from each chip into the air, to put an antenna on the instrument that picked up the electricity, could measure how much electricity was in the air and which side of the bow it was coming from. And then with software, you could do the rest. You could figure out how fast the bow was moving, where the bow was, how much bow you were using, the angle of the bow. There was a little pressure sensor sending wireless information to tell how your hand was squeezing the bow, the hair. You could measure everything. It was fantastic. But it turned out that when Yo-Yo's hand got close to the instrument, when he was playing at what's called the frog of the bow, the measurement went all wrong. And we hadn't planned for that. So actually my students went back into the lab, and they tested the circuit, and they realized that Yo-Yo's hand, any hand, they even took hamburger meat and put it in the circuit, and realized that anything organic was absorbing electricity from the circuit. So in fact, Yo-Yo's body was pulling out electricity from the air and messing up our circuit. So we had to compensate for that. Does anybody know what a theremin is? So theremin was one of the earliest, what? Yeah, the Beach Boys. Good vibrations, So that instrument was invented in the 20s. It had no computer in it, but it was an electric circuit that measured the closer the body came, your body absorbed electricity, changed either the note or the loudness. So we realized that unwittingly we'd invented a digital theremin. We hadn't wanted to do that. But we found out that if you turned the circuit around, and instead of pulling electricity out of the air, but we made this chair. When you sit on the chair and your rear end touches a piece of metal on the seat of the chair, you're coupled to an electric circuit. Electricity goes through your body, It does this to your hair, unfortunately, but that's a byproduct. Had to say that. And then with the chair, there are these two posts in front of the chair. You can see those four little objects. They're sensors, and the sensors measure how much electricity your body is sending out. So by moving your arms, it's an incredibly accurate instrument, very, very accurate, more accurate than the Microsoft Kinect, for instance, and this was a long time ago. So we realized you could make an instrument where by where your hand was, also by the shape of the movement, are you moving in a jagged way, a smooth way, are you moving stop and start continuously, all these things can be measured, and you could shape a melody, you could play a whole orchestra, you could play a rhythm instrument, and all of a sudden we had a virtuosic instrument that anybody could play without knowing the cello or any other instrument. So, you know, that's my daughter a while ago. That's Bono from U2 who played this. We made a special instrument for Prince. This idea of measuring the electricity in your body, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, if you can make this fine gesture measurement and analyze it for yo-yo, well, everybody can move their arms. Everybody can make an expression with their face. We should be able to make a hyper instrument for anybody. We should be able to use this same technology to make a bridge so that people who usually passively listen to music can also participate. So we started with this chair.
And that led to an opera.
An opera. It was actually a whole orchestra. We called it the Brain Opera. It was like walking. It was a big room about this size, filled up with about 100 of these instruments. Some of them are at the bottom. The one on the bottom left is a driving instrument where you could drive musical notes through a series of roads. Depending on how you drove, the music would change. The next one is the same electricity. You stepped on a metal plate, and you could change a big massive sound by moving your arms. You could sing, and the sound would adapt. Move your finger on a table and make melodies. And the audience could come in, experiment with these sounds, and then go into a theater just like this immediately. There were 3 of us on stage playing these kind of instruments. And about 50 or 60% of this brain opera I had composed and we had rehearsed ahead of time, and about 40% of it had been created by the audience right before, without their realizing they were contributing to this piece, and then they came in to see how all these parts fit together. So it was a big, big music collaboration.
And it's now permanently installed.
So we toured. It was commissioned by Lincoln Center in New York. It opened up there. We toured it around the world. And it's now permanently installed in Vienna at a special hands-on music museum that we designed there.
So let's go back now to MIT, in addition to your hyper instrument work, because there's a whole other side of what you're doing and what your students are doing that led to this incredible breakthrough that most of us know, Guitar Hero.
Yeah.
And I know that's a small part of this odyssey that you're on, but I really think it's a fascinating story and a great story, I think, actually, of how your creativity inspired a group of students who really built something that just became a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah. So the team that made that brain opera, there were about 75 students from all kinds of different departments and backgrounds working on that project. And it kind of trained a generation of people thinking about making interactive music experiences for the general public, both software and hardware. After we made that, I wanted to make simpler instruments, less expensive instruments, especially for children. So we made a project called Toy Symphony, where we made a series of toys, like the squeezy toy. This one, the fabric actually measures the electricity in your fingers, and as a young child squeezes it, you can change the quality of music. So you might go loudness, or like that. Or there might be a series of notes, which would be like something like that by squeezing. This is my favorite toy we made called a beat bug. This one's a rhythm instrument where you tap the instrument and it captures your rhythm. So you go, and then the 2 little bug antennas complexify the rhythm so that you go, and then you play with 8 of your friends, and you point your beat bug at your friend, tap it, your rhythm jumps over to your friend, and they have to react to it, so it teaches kids about rhythm and playing an ensemble. We also made software called Hyperscore, which I'm really proud of, which lets kids actually compose original music. So this uses a lot of intelligent software to take the lines and colors you draw, to shape melodies, harmonies, and push a button, and it takes these lines and you hear it, but it also writes out regular notes, so you can write a piece for an orchestra or for a rock band or for your music teachers at school or for your friends.
So their art becomes the musical notation.
Yeah, and actually one of the interesting things about this is that I think, like when my mom had us draw pictures of pieces when we were little kids, I think kids think of this as a notation for music rather than art. So, you know, they listen and they make the shapes they need to make a piece, and then you push a button and that turns into regular notes. And so all of this stuff, the software that it takes to have a piece of music that you can push and shove from one harmony to another, the way you touch a piece of music so that anybody can control it, you know, the way that everybody can participate, play in groups, led to Rock Band and Guitar Hero. These two students of mine, Alex Rogopoulos and Arana Gozi, were there working on most of these projects. Alex, the one on the left, his master's thesis was something called seed music, and he developed a technique at the Media Lab where you could take any piece of music, feed it through his software, and it came out on the other end encoded, so it had all the handles on it where you could take this piece now and stretch it one place to another, or kick it. You could say, okay, go towards this harmony, or become more complex. And we actually started with 2 joysticks where the joysticks could change the quality of the music. And Alex and Aran set up a company called Harmonix right down the block from MIT. It's still there, you know, a 5-minute walk from my office. And they took all of these ideas from the brain opera, these kind of games, and worked for about 10 years making games that were mostly this kind of free exploration. You know, you'd have like a music world that you could fly through or walk through, and the music would change in various ways. And actually, the games were doing pretty well, and they, you know, we helped consult and worked very closely on them. They used all the software that we developed together, and but they weren't doing that well.
Did they come to you at the very beginning and say, Tod, you know, this brain opera project we've been working on and all this amazing music we've been creating, we think there's a business there, there's a game business there, there's something for us to create and actually get funded and go do. Did they talk to you about it as an enterprise, or was it just kind of a lark that they wanted to go try for a bit? How did that come about?
They definitely talked about it from the beginning. They were both people, they were both incredibly good musicians and also very, very good technically. Alex on the left is a very good software designer. Aran is an expert at digital signal processing, plays the clarinet, so did this kind of hyper instrument analysis of the clarinet. But it turned out they're also both really good business people. And we had done a lot of work together, both with Yamaha and also with Sega, I remember in particular, thinking about how to take a lot of this hyper instrument technology and use it for the music engines for games, and also to use it for, there are a lot of patents that came out of the hyper instrument work, both for the measuring, the instrument measurement, and also for the smarts and the software. And Alex and Aran had both worked with me with a lot of these companies, so they'd made a lot of good contacts, and I think they definitely knew that there was a business there, for sure. But it turned out they were pretty good at it, but it took a long time. And they were just about to go out of business, and a company called Red Octane that basically, you know Dance Dance Revolution? Yeah? You know it, good. So anyway, it was a company that made the floor mats for Dance Dance Revolution, basically came to them and said, look, we like your games. They're doing pretty well. They're not doing that well. Actually, this other company said, we think that if you made a guitar game, it might do really well. And Alex and Aran, and even I said, you know, I don't think so. You know, we don't want to do that. Our games are more interesting than that. And Red Octane said, no, just give it a try, and we'll actually make the interface for you if you make the software. And so they said, okay, we'll give it a try. And the rest is, you know, they made this game, and nobody, all the stores didn't think it was going to be a big deal, and they bought, you know, very few copies when it first came out. And it turned out that I think 2 things were new in Guitar Hero when it first came out. One was the idea that, for all of you who've played it, one of the best things about these games and games like them is that they keep the game kind of rule of measuring very, very precisely how well you're doing and giving you incredibly good feedback. So you can tell immediately if you're playing in rhythm, if you're playing the right thing, if you're hitting the right notes. As you know, in these games, it dramatizes it by having the audience there that gets more and more excited. The better you're doing, the music sounds better. The worse you're doing, the music sounds wimpy, and the audience starts leaving, and they finally pull out the plug. You get the message. But that, that way of judging the way you were doing was incredibly important. And the other thing is, it turned out there were millions and millions of people, mostly kind of adolescent males, who had this idea of not just playing air guitar, but playing a real guitar in a virtuosic way that nobody had ever offered that as a possibility. And the second it was there, it was like, oh my God, I got to try it. And so those two things, it's as simple as that, the measurement and that actual interface. If you've done a cello.
Yeah. Somehow Cello Hero doesn't quite have the ring to it, I think.
Much as the idealist in me knows someday that will happen, but maybe not right away. And actually, I think one of the big questions now, and maybe it's a good segue to kind of the last example, is these games have been around for 7-8 years now. They peaked about 2 years ago. They're still going, but they're not as popular as they were, partly because any game gets tired. But also, I think there's a real question about how to go to the next step. They're really fun to play. They show that people are interested in participating in music making and not just passive listening if they're given the right opportunity. But for those of you who played these games, they're not that musical. I mean, they're not like playing the cello. They're not like composing your own music. You can't personalize the way it sounds, the way every single guitarist sounds just a little bit different. If you're playing with other people like our beat bugs, you play these instruments and you look at your friends in the eye and send the music. If you're playing Guitar Hero, you're probably you're there with 4 or 5 people, but you're all looking at the screen because you've got to synchronize. So you can't compose your own music for it. So the big question now is how to keep what's good about these games and get people interested, but how to explode them, make them much more musical, much more personal, much more creative. And that's what really interests us.
For you, what's missing, I mean, you just said it, for you, what's missing, as incredible as the game is that sense of creativity.
Yeah, it's true. And I think the trick with creativity is, so many people make things and post them on the internet right now. I've got a 14-year-old daughter who actually has she's got a huge YouTube channel of songs she makes and covers she does and things. Lots of people make things. The question, I think, is how to be in an environment where you can make things and get feedback from other people so that everybody who's making things is getting better and better and better. And how can you collaborate with other people on making interesting things, and how can the technology help you do that? So we're very interested in making that kind of tool and setting up a situation where people are encouraged to make things on their own and also to collaborate in all kinds of unusual ways.
And that's the bridge to the Toronto project.
It is.
It's not, I actually have described it incorrectly, I think, to a couple of people as crowdsourcing a symphony, but that's not what it is at all, is it? I mean, after talking to you about this leading up to tonight, this is not a crowdsourcing project. It's something entirely different.
It isn't. And I'll give you an example of a crowdsourcing music project. You may have heard about this, but Hans Zimmer, who is one of the absolute top, great film composer, just finished the score, I guess, because it's coming out soon, for the new Batman movie. And about 4 or 5 months ago, he posted a website with a crowdsourcing request where he said, you can go look it up, Hans Zimmer, Batman. And he basically said, I'm looking for sounds from you to put into the movie. So if you make a sound, especially a vocal sound, sing, scream, say a word, and send it to me, I will put this in the music. And then I'll put this in the film. And then he also said, using today's technology, which is of course true, don't worry about what you do, because no matter what you do, I can make it rhythmically interesting, or I can auto-tune it and I can make it fit. So I don't know what the result was, but I'm sure that a lot of people sent in their sounds. I'm also pretty sure, I haven't seen the movie yet, but my guess is that it'd probably be really, really hard to find your sound in the Batman movie. I don't know, but I imagine that's probably true. And I also think that Hans Zimmer probably had a pretty clear idea. Either he wanted those sounds like if you were an extra in a huge crowd scene. He wanted those sounds to represent lots of voices, but it doesn't really matter so much who's who. And also, I think he probably had a pretty clear idea of the final result, so he probably would take your sound and plug it into like a mosaic, like one of those big pictures that's made up of lots of little pictures. So that is an example of crowdsourcing. But what I want to do is something completely different. It's more like what I described is special about MIT or the Media Lab and the way I like to work in general. When I do a project like the Brain Opera or even Death and the Powers, which I showed you. I mean, I wrote the music for Death and the Powers, but we worked for years on that project, thinking of the story, designing the technology, thinking about how the music and the image all fit together, thinking about the way it would finally feel to an audience. And I did that with a fairly large group of people, including Robert Pinsky, the poet laureate, and including Alex McDowell, a great Hollywood production designer, but also with professors and graduate students and undergrads and people who'd never done anything like that. And we really solved a lot of the problems and invented a lot of the ideas for the opera together. It was a wonderful way to work. And so what I've said to Toronto is, I propose that I've been asked to write a symphony, but I'd really like to write this with the city. And I'd like the symphony to be a kind of portrait of the city, but I'd like to set up a collaboration where every step of the way we make this together. And it's not I'm not just taking little things that you send me and plugging them in somewhere. We're really going to make this together. Maybe the best, I've got a little video that gives you a glimpse of that.
Great.
I'm Tod Machover, and I'm very happy to invite you to participate in an exciting new project called the Toronto Symphony. We're doing something pretty unusual. We're going to make a new symphony. We're inviting everybody in the city of Toronto to collaborate with me over the coming months to shape this symphony, to make the music, and to create it together. Toronto is one of the most international cities in the world, has every idea, every kind of person, every nationality, every sound that you can imagine. And one thing that's always struck me about Toronto is how it combines this complexity with an incredible sense of order and beauty as well. I've started off this process by imagining a kind of shape and picture of a Toronto symphony. We'll use this as a way to imagine this symphony together. I'm going to send out requests for different kinds of sounds, different kinds of melodies, different kinds of music, and I'm hoping that as many people as possible will send things back to me. I'm going to sit down and make some of this material as well. Sometimes it'll be chords, sometimes it'll be melodies, sometimes it'll be sounds, sometimes it'll be a section of a piece, and I'll send it out to all of you so you can let me know what you think, and also so that you can vary it, you can tweak it, you can add to it. We're going to take sessions over the coming months, every few weeks, and together we'll shape this clay into final sections of the piece that we all like. So I invite you all to participate. Let's begin. So we launched this in Toronto on the 15th of June, less than 2 weeks ago, and have invited the whole city to participate. At the opening event, since we hadn't announced it to the city of Toronto, I actually got in touch with the symphony itself, and I said, would you like to be the first collaborators? So I made a series, actually I made a series of chords, a chord progression, kind of told a little story on its own. I sent it to the orchestra, and I said, I'll give you 2 weeks, and anybody who wants to, take my chords, add new chords to add more color in between my chords. If you want to write melodies on my chords, do that. If any of these sounds suggest something new, write that out or make that and send it back to me. And I thought nobody would honestly do anything, but a huge number of people from the orchestra actually sent me music. So I had to spend a weekend, I had to do it. I had to listen to it all. I had to take my chords, incorporate it, and make a piece that was really with their material and my material, plus material that we could improvise with live. And we did that on stage at a big event in Toronto and at a huge festival. And so now we've invited the city. There's a website. You can go to toronto.media. You could say you live in Toronto and help write this thing if you want. But right now, I've asked people to send either ideas of or recordings of the most typical sound from Toronto that they know, and if possible, to send me something that nobody else would have thought of. So I'm getting actually thousands of these, and what my goal is to do, so the first step is to go through these sounds, go back, discuss them. I'm going to turn all of these sounds into orchestra sounds, so I'm not going to go the easy route and just play back recordings. We're going to make the orchestra sound like the screech of the... Everybody in Toronto talks about the sound of the streetcar and the way it screeches at a particular location. I've got hundreds of people, so we'll have the orchestra screech like a streetcar. But I'm very excited about this because if we can get a large group of people thinking out loud about making this piece and sharing ideas and evaluating things together and doing things live together, I think it won't just be exciting, but I think it'll represent a new relationship between professionals in the industry and the general audience and people like an orchestra who can work together using technology in a much healthier way. I just think it'll be exciting.
There was a little glimpse in there of this HyperChord software that we were talking about earlier.
HyperScore, yeah.
The colors, I'm sorry, HyperScore, where the colors are drawn and the lines and shapes become music. Are you actively using that as part of this project?
When I first thought of the project, I thought maybe we'd only use HyperScore because it's been out for several years, it's tested, we use it all around the world. So it's one of the tools. In fact, I just found out yesterday, it's really exciting. The entire school board for all of Greater Toronto, middle school and high school, is going to learn HyperScore, and they're going to develop a curriculum over the summer. So starting in the fall, we won't have much time. The premiere is March 9th. So September, October, into November, we'll have lots of kids around Toronto making material with HyperScore. But we're going to use lots of things besides HyperScore. You can go out and record on your smartphone. You can use other software packages. Actually, I'm going to, my 14-year-old daughter is interning this summer, and her job is to contact all the indie rock bands in Toronto and see if they can get involved. My idea for the indie rock bands is to say, my idea is to make 1 second of sound. My daughter says, nah, it's got to be 5 seconds. But I want them to make 1 second of sound that identifies their band so that anybody hearing that 1 second goes, wow, that's really exciting, plus I know who made that. And make it in a studio. So we're collecting sounds and ideas in all kinds of ways.
It's late June, and we see by the date you're delivering this on March 9th. So how are you feeling about that?
It's nice to have a day in California away from... I love what I do because I let my imagination go and I follow it where, when an idea feels exciting to me, I feel like I can go and realize it. Most of these ideas take me places that I didn't expect. I think of all the projects I've ever done, this one's the scariest. Because for it to work, for it to really feel right, it has to satisfy two qualities. One is, even though I'm making this piece with lots of other people, it has to be a fantastic piece. When you go to hear the orchestra play it on March 9th, everybody sitting there has to just listen to it as a piece of music and say, I love it, it's beautiful, and other people want to play it. So that's hard if you're not controlling it all yourself. The other thing is, for it to work right, unlike with crowdsourcing, my idea is it really has to feel both like my piece. I have to feel like, wow, I invested in this and it really feels like something I made, but every single person who participates has to feel that way too. They have to feel not just like they sent something out into the void and it disappeared, but that they've had a role in shaping this and they feel like they've contributed. Getting those two things right is, nobody's ever done it, and I hope we can do it. But I'm definitely nervous.
So we have some great questions from the audience. Let's get to a few of these now.
Wonderful.
Do you feel that the human interpreter will always be a pivotal part of a performance? Could machines ever learn enough to simulate or feel a realistic emotional performance experience? And do you hope so?
Great question. People differ on this. I think philosophically and maybe technically too. My deep feeling is that what technology is for is to allow humans to be more human, to unleash capabilities that we have. So I always, the reason I think I build these instruments and these tools is that I always think about technology as ways of allowing us to be more creative, us to shape music better, us to find the music we like. And so I do not hope so. I do not long for a machine that can make musical decisions for me or make a performance instead of a person. I do think that one of the great things about machines is that it allows us to test a lot of our ideas. So there are people all around the world doing fantastic research in exactly what was asked, and even some people at the Media Lab. What would it take to have a computer, get like a piece of sheet music for Bach or the sheet music for the Beatles, and like a musician, analyze it, decide how to interpret it, and then make a performance all on its own. There's a lot of wonderful work being done in that area, and even some of it sounds pretty darn good. My own feeling is, number one, that shouldn't be the end goal. You'd love to have a human being. Even if it were really good, you'd want a human being to kind of tweak it and shape it at the end. And I think there's a bigger question, which is the only reason music means anything, in my view, is that it's a way for people to express something about life and something about the world, something about nature to each other. It has no other purpose. And if there isn't a human being behind thinking of the idea in the beginning and shaping it and sharing it and reacting to your reaction, to me, it doesn't have a lot of meaning. So I'd like to see a human being in the loop, and you also want the machine to be as smart as possible. You want both.
Here's a question about, we've talked a lot about what you're doing to sense and measure gestures with hyper instruments. Have you ever done anything to interface with or measure the human voice, either solo or chorus?
Great question, yeah. Who asked that question? No, so it just so happens we're doing a big project on the voice right now. The voice is very, very difficult because unlike an instrument, cello's difficult because you've got this complex, you've got wood and horsehair and vibrating strings and a human body. So that's harder already to measure than a keyboard where you just have maybe electric signals or a hammer hitting a string. The voice is our most powerful instrument. It is the next frontier, the thing you want to tap, the thing you want to unleash in everybody. We all want to, I think, I'd love to find a way to help us all use our voices in deeper and deeper ways. But what do you measure? Really, the only thing that's easy to measure is the sound itself. So I can measure something with a microphone. Everything else is pretty tough. I can measure the vibration of my vocal cords, but it's vibrating all over the place, and it's vibrating differently here. It's vibrating differently here, here, here. It vibrates here also. It vibrates in my lungs. That's different. Where do you measure it? It vibrates inside differently than it vibrates outside. I can't really easily measure the vibration inside my body. There's acoustically amazing things that happen inside, in my vocal cavities, all through my head. So it's very, very difficult to measure. And then what do you want to do? The voice is already pretty wonderful. When you sing, your own voice kind of fills up your head. So even if there were an added sound, would it be in the room? Would it be in headphones? Where would it be? So it's a wonderful thing to do, and it's very difficult. But we're working on it right now. We're actually working on a project to allow, it's kind of an experience. We're actually designing a series of little rooms. I haven't actually told anybody this yet. We're designing a series of rooms. It's for a wonderful place in Paris. So in principle, it'll open in Paris a year from this fall. And it's a vocal experience where you'll go into things that are kind of like monk cells and use your voice to make the environment resonate. Each room will have a different experience, and then you'll go into a larger room with about 10 people, and it's almost like you're training in these individual experiences, and then you'll have an experience like you'll be part of a chorus, or almost like somewhere between a chorus and a meditation, like a mantra session with other people, where we will measure people's voices, and we'll measure both individual voices and the connection between voices. And to show you how difficult a problem it is, two of my main collaborators on this project are, number one, MIT's main expert in tissue. So this is a person who's a specialist in tissue and cartilage who measures the vibrations inside the body and the way electricity works in all of our joints, because we're trying to measure exactly how your voice does vibrate and affect different parts of your body. And the other person is the Buddhist chaplain at MIT, who's a very, very thoughtful, intelligent person, who also is, an expert in chant and the tradition of meditation and sound, and what is known about it scientifically, and especially what isn't known about it. So we're going to learn as much as we can about the voice over the coming year, and if I come back in a year, I'll sing for you. We can all sing.
That's great. So this is a question that sounds like it's from Tod Machover, circa 1971. I'm in high school. I play cello. I love music. I'm also on the robot team, have won many prizes. What should I major in?
Great question. Well, I think the good news is that, in 1971, the idea that technology would be an incredibly natural part of music was kind of crazy. But now, technology is everywhere. Even an orchestra, when it records a piece by Beethoven, has sophisticated microphones and unbelievably sophisticated studio technique to make it sound just right. Technology is everywhere. Even at Juilliard, you use all kinds of technology to notate your scores, and so there are many places where you can study music and technology connected. Robotics is fantastic because I think part of robotics is making machines that can do things that human beings can't, or maybe can extend what human beings can do. In some ways, you can think about the kind of things that we put on Yo-Yo's wrist, or things that might be part of an instrument, as a type of robotics that play duos with human beings. So I think robotics are extremely relevant for the future of music instruments and music performance. So good news number one is there are many places where you can actually go and study these things together. I think in general, the thing I would counsel most is that things are changing so fast that you don't want to learn the current techniques for, how do I use the software that's out there right now to make nice sounds in music? How do I, what's the current robotic technology? How can I build, the current state-of-the-art robot? What do I need to know for software or hardware to do that? You want to study the underlying design and intellectual principles as much as possible. You want to study how music works. You want to study how software works. You want to study how hardware works. You want to understand for yourself what your motivation is in doing this. Your motivation might be writing music. It might be making instruments. It might be another area that we're very interested in, is it might be thinking about how music affects our emotions and how it affects our health. Maybe you want to think about how you bring science and technology and music together to actually diagnose illness or help people's memory. So you want to study the underlying theories and ideas behind these fields rather than the current techniques, because things are going to change and you're going to have to keep up with the change and understand them deeply. And then you probably won't know it as a freshman, but you want to go a place where there's a lot of fluidity between these disciplines so that you can find out what it is for you personally, why you want to bring these things together. Because you're probably going to have to maybe define your own major or come to an anti-disciplinary lab where you can find people with these different skills to help advise you. So don't go to a place where the disciplines are too separate, and don't go to a place that only teaches you, I won't name any names, but that teaches you, teaches you the current state of affairs and the current techniques. You want to go as deep as possible because you're going to have to make the connections. You want to make the connections.
We have a number of questions here about other things that are going on at the Media Lab, and I think you could probably talk about that in a whole nother program. So maybe you could just give us a couple of ideas or examples of other things that are going on at the Media Lab now.
So I think, well, one thing that's very interesting at the Media Lab is that it started out very close to multimedia. So when it first started, it was one of the main places that brought computers and visualization and publishing together. So when I first got there, everything was on the screen. Through projects like the Cello project, things migrated into objects. So 10 or 15 years ago, one of the big things at the Media Lab was something called Things That Think. How do you make objects which understand something about the way they're used? How do you use the environment as a way of, kind of think of the environment as an interface. You know, could this chair, by the way I move in the chair, send information to you rather than needing a computer terminal? But I think one of the most recent things at the Media Lab is studying bodies and minds. So not way past just computers. So two of my colleagues who are fairly new at the Media Lab, there's a guy named Hugh Herr, who's quite well known. He's about 40 years old now. When he was 17, all he liked to do was climb mountains. He was one of the top-ranked mountain climbers in the US, and he actually told me he was an awful student, just wasn't very good, didn't care. And at 17, he had an accident mountain climbing and lost both his legs. And he was so upset with how bad the artificial legs were that he, you know, talk about a motivation, he decided that his goal in life was to make artificial limbs as good as your original limbs. So we hired him at the Media Lab, and he's now one of the world's top designers of intelligent prosthetics. He tests these things himself. So he designs arms, legs, body parts, and his basic idea is that if you're going to have a replacement of a body part, why can't it be better than the original? So he is, again, quite a high-ranked mountain climber. And when he climbs mountains, he climbs with a golf bag with 10 pairs of legs. And so he has a pair of legs for ice, and a pair of legs for crevices, and a pair of legs for 10-foot extensions. And he goes, you know, you can't do that. So, and then Ed Boyden, we hired because, you know, as most of you know, one of the most exciting fields right now is neuroscience. All the study of, you know, who we are through studying our brain and our minds, and all the way from studying the biology to the cognition to modeling it in computers. It's so vibrant, and we can, you know, for the first time actually start to study actually what goes on rather than just make theories. And so we hired somebody at the Media Lab who had gone to MIT for bachelor's and master's, did his PhD here at Stanford, has a strong background in neuroscience, but also a background in physics and mechanical engineering, as one of the few people who is not just studying the basic principles of neuroscience, but is actually making devices that we can test and that can be tested on humans, you know, hopefully fairly soon. He has devices now which stimulate the outside of your brain to either suppress or stimulate certain activities in your brain, like suppress depression, enhance creativity, let's say. But he's working on other techniques. There's a technique that he's doing in collaboration with colleagues at Stanford, actually, that uses optics to stimulate and to read individual neurons. That, you know, the belief is that maybe that's the beginning to actually, maybe in our lifetimes, read thoughts, or to, I mean, literally, you know, what would mind reading be? So that's one really exciting thing we're doing at the Media Lab. Well, they're anyway, maybe,
sure.
Yeah, bodies and minds.
Given everything you're working on, what you've just said, I can understand why this question was asked, which is, in what ways can a non-resident student at MIT get involved with the Media Lab?
So I guess that means a student who's a student somewhere else, perhaps?
I would think so, yeah.
It's definitely true that the easiest way to get involved at the Media Lab, it's kind of set up for being a student there. So you can apply. And you know, it's a great, anyway, it's a fun place to be a student. MIT has been, you know, Stanford also, Harvard also, but MIT's been a real pioneer in open courseware. So MIT was the first place that put all of its curriculum online so that people around the world for free could get all the knowledge from MIT, not for a degree, but just to follow it. That's very, very popular now. MIT just announced the collaboration with Harvard called MIT-X, which is the next step, which is to get certification and degrees and actually participate in lectures if you're not there. How to actually participate in projects, which is is really the interesting part. You know, how can you collaborate on these projects is not so simple, because that's something which happens when you have FaceTime with people and you know, you actually share ideas. Maybe we need to invent kind of a Toronto Symphony-like project, which is some other design project, you know, a project which is building or inventing something where, you know, we open it up to people, you know, who could apply and just be part of a team, even if they're not there. So I'll invent something. Tell me who you are.
So let me ask you one final question. You've talked about trying to bring Death and the Powers to the Bay Area.
We are bringing it to the Bay
You are
Area.
bringing it to the Bay Area. You've obviously got this major Toronto project going on, and these are the short-term things that are keeping Tod Machover busy. But in the future, if you think about what's next, capital N, what is the next big thing that you're going to be working on?
I think the thing that'll keep me busy for a little while is kind of follows on from what we've been talking about, and especially from what we just talked about brain science. And I think that as we start understanding more and more about what happens in our minds while we're listening to music, why it affects us the way we do, why we feel certain emotions, why we get tingles, why it affects our body in different ways. We understand more and more about the effect that music has on us. And that starts to suggest to me, combined with this collaborative model of involving the audience in making music and in performing music, I think the big change is going to be, if you think about it, every hit piece of music from the beginning of time until now, whether it's Beethoven or the Beatles or anybody, the way a hit piece of music works is that somebody figures out a hook, a core, a theme, some musical sound that is going to catch the imagination of millions or billions of people. So it's the same bit of music that is going to appeal to some large number of people. And that's what it means for the music to be popular. And that's how music you know, propagates to groups, and that's how music brings us together. But I think that another form of music, which I'd like to help develop over these coming years, is the opposite. Think of what it would be like if a piece of music could be composed and adapted and customized just for you. So think what it would be like if we could have something that I think of it as personal music, if we think of it that way. So think of what it would be if a piece of music could be specially designed for your genetics, you know, just your family, the way you were brought up, the way your head is shaped, you know, the acoustics of your auditory canal, the music you've listened to, the things you like and you don't like, the way you're feeling today, the way you'd like to feel. If a piece of music could be optimized so that it could be right in that sweet spot, I think that we could have music which would have even greater power that we can't even imagine for each of us individually. And the exciting thing is that not only would that music have a different effect, but I think it would totally redefine the relationship between me as a listener and you as a performer, you as a creator. Because what would have to happen is we'd have to go much further in the idea that a piece of music that would be composed would be malleable, and the piece wouldn't be finished when I would send it to you. The piece would have possibilities that would then adapt to you, and they might adapt automatically, but that goes back to the question of, do you want them just to adapt automatically? And I think you don't. So they'd get to you, and you'd be able to tweak it and touch it, and maybe it would look at your facial expressions, and you'd talk to it, and it would adapt depending on the way you were feeling. But maybe there'd be a new profession. You know, there'd be somebody in the middle who'd be kind of the performer or the adapter, or your psychiatrist or doctor, you know, the person who, your friend, the person who's kind of knows things about you that you're not even sure you know, and that person would help shape this. And so this kind of personal music, which really would be shared between creators and yourself, but at the end of the day would be something that would really only work its total magic for you at a particular moment, and its full power right now is something I really believe in and I want to work for. And that's what really keeps me up at night, but that's what I'll be doing for these next years.
How cool. So thank you so much, Tod, for being with us tonight. Enjoyed having you.
Thank you.